So today is all about visceral fat. Now, let's get one thing crystal clear. It's super healthy to have some fat. It gets demonized all the time, but some body fat is a necessity for general health. But what if I told you not all fat was created equally? Now, this is where the visceral fat comes in. It's the hidden fat. It's stored deep in the belly, and it surrounds all your vital organs, your pancreas, your liver, your intestines, and it can have a profoundly negative impact on your body due to this close proximity and how metabolically active it can be. And I think there's a real misconception out there where people just think fat kind of does nothing, but it plays a really integral role, and it does a whole bunch of things. And today we want to get kind of into visceral fat, and I really want you to pick up, the importance of why we track it at Fit, or why we want to have some measurement, and potentially why something like the scale isn't really doing you justice in terms of whatever it's kind of throwing back at you, because visceral fat plays a really, really, really important role in your longevity, really, and your health span. So most of your fat, it's kind of stored under the skin, right? That's your subcutaneous fat. That's the one that we all know about. You can see it. But the rest is hidden. And this is our visceral fat. Everyone has some visceral fat. Let's get that crystal clear. But how much we have is kind of where the serious health issues can discern with. So it has a really, really big role in, from the inside out, in sabotaging our health. And like it'll disrupt all sorts of bodily functions and organ functions. So it's pretty nasty, or can be nasty, especially in too higher amounts. So it's one of the things that gives people the sort of apple appearance, I guess we'd call it, through just how it's stored. So it helps, like it releases hormones, chemicals, proteins. All in all, it really ramps up inflammation in the body and toxicity. So the reason we care about visceral fat more than our subcutaneous counterpart is really due to this toxicity and inflammation that it gives off, and the cascade that comes from that. So we'll deep dive into that a little bit later, but that's kind of the crux of it. And you can use subcutaneous kind of as a proxy for visceral, because your visceral fat will be about 1/10 of your total body fat. So theoretically, the more body fat you have, the more visceral fat you'll contain. But we've all heard the term skinny fat. I don't love it, but we've all heard it. And there are sort of genetic outliers that, through certain lifestyle choices and factors that they have, can be in a healthy weight category or BMI, but have a really high visceral fat. And again, we'll go into some factors on how that happens. And that's how people think like, oh, I can't believe this person has X, insert a metabolic condition. A lot of that can be down to some of the visceral fat that they've got internally rather than subcutaneous. And that's a real big factor. So one of the things, really easy, you can use a tape measure. That's, again, a really simple proxy that people can use, and you do it around your waist, 80 centimeters for females, 94 centimeters for males. But again, it's a loose proxy on where you want your waist to be. Anything above increases risk factors for some metabolic conditions. We're talking hypertension, diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, anything to do with inflammation. So a lot of like arthritis and osteoarthritis in there. What we use more in the studio is our in-body, or a bioimpedance device. They're really easy. They're really accessible. You can use like a DEXA scan and things like that. They're just a little bit harder to get and do. So we use in-body, and it'll give you a number. So next time you get it, go and look at the visceral fat number. It goes from 1 to 20. It gives you an estimated volume area. So that's kind of what your visceral fat would be anyway. First phase is we want it under 10. Because the risk factors just go up the higher that is. Under 10 is where we want to start, and then I want it to be 4 or under. Because if we get to 5 and above, the risk factors for things like high triglycerides, elevated cholesterol, heart disease, diabetes, hypertension go up by a factor of 5 starting at 5, which is pretty high. and that's only at 5. It goes up to 20. So at 10, the number 10, it says that you have 100 centimeters squared of volume of visceral fat surrounding your organs. That's kind of the volumized version, and it spits it out as the number 10. So that'll obviously be 9 and 8 will give you the volume that you've got. But all I want people to think of is 10 to start, then let's get it under 5 to 4. Once it's 4 and under, I don't really mind. With a lot of these metrics, whether it's overall body fat or visceral fat, you get the biggest bang for buck health improvement at the top end. So whatever's the top down to the middle will give you much more bang for buck than, middle to the bottom end. So then that works pretty much across the board for most metrics. Does that make sense so far? Beautiful. Because what we want to do is I'm going to do a little share screen today. If this works. Oh, we might be running into some, there we go. Beautiful. Can we see that, team?
Perfect.
Perfect. So there's a little presentation that we've got together, and this is a really profound image. So on the left, you can clearly see just a stomach cavity. Intestines are there, followed by the large intestine over the top. And that's kind of what it should look like. That'd be a healthy internal view of the cavity. On the right would be the visceral fat. And unfortunately, it's hidden, but I genuinely believe if we could actually see what was happening internally, people would make different choices. But because it's so hidden all the time, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind for a lot of people. So profound picture that I think about a lot, probably more than I should, when I'm making decisions, because that is what's happening underneath. We just can't see it. Now, with visceral fat, I actually want to talk about one of the largest mechanisms on how it occurs. So with people, high intakes of sugar and alcohol and a high carbohydrate diet falls into this as well. All too frequent with omega-6s. So let's think processed foods, things that have lots of vegetable oils or seed oils and GMO, and lots of stress with a lack of exercise. These are our lifestyle factors that are going to kind of, create a pro visceral fat environment. And what these do is they'll increase your insulin, and insulin gets a bad rap, but it's a really, really, really important hormone. And what it does is you eat something, the sugar or the carbohydrate, it'll get broken down into glucose, and then you'll have elevated blood glucose, and that's fine. But then what will happen is your body responds by producing insulin to drag the glucose or the sugar out of the blood and get utilized for something, whether it's energy, and it'll take it to a cell to be utilized, which is really important. Problem is people are just eating too much carbohydrates, too many sugars, too much alcohol, too frequently, all the time. And what happens to the body is over time, the cells become really resistant to that insulin. So the body, in response to that, will then produce more insulin to try to get the level of blood glucose down, and then the cells just aren't receptive to it. So through this journey, there'll be sensors, it will deter the signaling pathways on the cells to not utilize the insulin well or efficient. So the body has to produce more. And with that, you get a thing called insulin resistance. And what I learned is there's over 1 million Australians with diabetes, and there's a further 2 million, and this is all diagnosed, with pre-diabetic or on the verge of insulin resistance, and that'd be our step before. And that's only the diagnosis. We're already at 3 to 3.5, depending on the numbers there, million. I would dare say there'd be a lot more with the factors of diet that are out there in the community and how people approach nutrition. So, and this is huge. I would consider insulin resistance one of the major factors for reducing somebody's health quality and definitely their metabolic disorders and their life expectancy. It has a huge effect. So it increases that insulin in a nice little feedback loop, which then produces visceral fat. So excess energy in the bloodstream with high insulin it just needs to eventually be stored. And by this stage, you'll more than likely have fatty liver. There might be some fat around the heart, and then the body will have to store it somewhere. Some of it will go under the skin, of course, and then some of it will go into the abdominal cavity, which is going to be our spillover for any excess energy. Now, the problem with the visceral fat is what I said before, it's really metabolically active. So it actually releases proteins and disrupts organ function, and it releases a thing called cytokines. And they are one of the things that affects insulin pathways, and it makes you less responsive to the insulin. All of this means, and it also increases inflammation. So that's not small. That inflammatory response that you get from high amounts of visceral fat creates systemic stress in the body, systemic inflammation in the body, and it becomes a negative feedback loop. And that inflammation can lead to pretty big health factors: cancers, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, type 2 diabetes, autoimmune diseases, pulmonary diseases, and neurological disorders, just to name a few of the things that are related to having a high systemic inflammatory response in the body. And that's kind of why they consider obesity as a risk factor. That pro-inflammatory body with high amounts of stress then leads to more insulin resistance through a whole bunch of hormonal disruptions, like adrenal function and inflammation, and a lot of pathways that are disrupted on the back end of those. And then the cycle continues: more insulin resistance, more visceral fat. It's a tough cycle to break, which is why it's so important that we discuss the insulin resistance and the visceral fat from it. So a lot of people will be like, well, what is insulin resistance? It's eating processed carbs and sugar, and alcohol's in there because alcohol gets metabolized in a really similar way to carbohydrates, which makes sense considering it's mainly fermented from fruits a lot of the time. So that will cause insulin, which will then make the cells resistant over time, and that gets stored as fat, which then most people with the high carbohydrate, high processed sugar, lots of alcohol diet are tired and hungry all the time, and then they fix that with eating more carbohydrates or highly processed sweets and or alcohol, or all of the above all in one, which further gives them the insulin resistance. And it's the body's smart, right? It has insulin resistance as a protective mechanism for just the amount of insulin that's getting peddled around. The amount of insulin that's getting peddled around the body in response to the blood glucose levels. So the best benefit is to reduce the blood glucose levels rather than looking at anything else. Does that all make sense so far? Yeah,
it does, and I think it answered my question. When you're talking about eating too much in the way of carbohydrates, you're talking your simple, like your processed. You're not talking you're having a bowl of brown rice, obviously.
no, and like it's a couple of things actually, and it's a really great question. I'll exit this one and get us back into. So it's actually a whole bunch of things, and the best benefits that I've got for you, it's about 6 different factors that will help reduce it. And definitely number one is nutrition, right? So when we do macro plans for people, like we want about 40%, give or take, different for each individual, but about 40% of their diet to be from carbohydrates, just as a standard macronutrient. What we tend to see early on is 60 to 70% plus, and then not even good quality carbohydrates, which would be the second factor. It's really, as you said, Jeffrey, really highly processed, really refined sugars. Really, like that's what most people are getting in their diet too often. There's a whole bunch of things that happen, and that's a really good inflammatory pathway, but it's also just giving you too much insulin too often. So a slight reduction in carbohydrates is still good, because you don't even, the good carbohydrates, you don't want a whole diet full of them, but getting the right quality in, whole foods, always the way to go. The other thing you can do is making sure you get adequate protein in, which most people know, but most people undereat protein. And by no means does it have to be animal protein at all. I just need protein. It does a twofold effect, protein. One, with the right training, it'll help increase your lean body mass. So it'll increase your muscle mass. And that's really important, which makes you more insulin sensitive. So skeletal muscle is much more metabolically active than your fat counterpart, which means blood glucose can get utilized better. It also increases things like mitochondria, which is just your engine for fuel in the body. The density of that improves, and it helps with hormonal regulation. So like skeletal muscle is always the win for helping visceral fat and helping maintain good blood sugar regulation. The other thing is it slows down the absorption of your carbohydrates. So it does a whole bunch of things in your gut. It'll send signals to say that, hey, we've got protein in here. So it slows down the emptying into the intestine. And then by default with that, the carbohydrates you eat with it just absorb slower. So the way I like to think about it is with the carbohydrates, it's everyone's in the studio, let's say, and it's a really busy studio. If it's all carbohydrates, it's just the roller door comes up and everyone can just run out onto the street. If you've got protein in your meal, the roller door's down and everyone's going single file out the front door. Just by default of that, it'll take longer for everyone to get from the studio out to the front. And that is another key thing. That the third thing, fiber does the same thing. It just slows the absorption of your carbohydrates, which again, people are just eating the wrong kind in too high quantities too frequently. So add fiber, add protein. It'll make a monumental difference. So not just your energy levels, but that blood sugar. What do we need in terms of carbohydrates? A fistful, so that much, or about a cup, should be enough in most meals. That's enough carbohydrate source. And the same thing, vegetables, fistful. I say minimum one. Would love two, but we can start with one for a whole bunch of vitamins and minerals, but mainly for that fiber content in the context of what we're talking about today. Protein, simple. If it's not meat, go fist, but it can be a palm size. So that fat, and then this wide up and around, just the palm should be enough in most meals. And really limit the processed foods. Processed foods really, they just trigger a really high inflammatory response. They're filled with junk, if I'm being honest, but a lot of them are filled with vegetable oils, and vegetable oils high in omega-6, and most people's omega-6 to 3 ratios are completely out of whack. Like we want them as close to 1-to-1 as possible. Omega-3 being things that are found in fish, your salmons that people are touting. Most people are 20-to-1. So they're so far off, and we want to get it down to at least 4-to-1. So, and processed foods are really, really, really high in omega-6, and they'll cause a super high inflammatory response in the body. Sugary beverages to a minimum, and alcoholic beverages to a minimum if it's something that you're partaking in. The other really easy one is taking something like apple cider vinegar, teaspoon diluted into 100 ml of water before your meals. And you can take something like berberine, and they all significantly improve your insulin sensitivity and your blood sugar regulation, which then in turn will help with visceral fat storage. The two other ones is movement. Like we're too sedentary, and that's kind of one of the reasons. And the skinny fat terminology, a lot of the people that are in that category are really sedentary, so they don't move, and they have a highly processed, highly refined carbohydrate diet, and that's kind of where that visceral adiposity starts to deposit for them. Walking after meals is one of the best ways to regulate your blood sugar. So 10 to 15 minutes is normally enough, but just any daily step count or times walking will be enough. But the big heavy hitter will be resistance training, because we talked about it before. One of the best ways to get yourself metabolically active, get those hormones regulating, is to build more skeletal muscle. It really reduces as life goes on. So you want to build it while you can, so that you can, keep things like insulin resistance at bay and make yourself more insulin sensitive. And the more sensitive you are, the better. The other one is we need to take care of ourselves. We're super stressed at the moment. Most people I talk to daily, there's a lot going on, and that high stress systemic cortisol environment plays havoc on your adrenals. They have to work really, really, really hard. And it's a hormone disruptor. Like it'll wreak havoc on your appetite hormones, leptin and ghrelin. It'll do really interesting things like in terms of testosterone. It'll then switch a lot of your DHEA, which is a precursor, into being more estrogen based rather than testosterone based, which has a really vast impact on just maintaining weight. One of the reasons that people gain weight is that particular reason and that pathway that's not working for them anymore. So reducing the stress via some form of restoration or sauna, meditation, yoga, breathwork, you take your pick, could be reading, and then prioritizing a really, really, really good sleep routine and sleep hygiene will significantly improve just the overall inflammatory response of the body and the overall stress response for the body. So they're super simple. There's really only a couple of basic lifestyle factors that are the big heavy hitters. And if we can reduce overall body fat, but look at the things that will help reduce specific visceral fat, people will be well on their way to living a much healthier and happier life. And the way I like to think about it is kind of feeling good from the inside out rather than just looking at the out, which is kind of most people's focus. Do you have one sort of takeaway from today's catch up, Jeffrey, at all?
I think it's actually, it's simpler than you realize, isn't it? And I was just thinking there, wouldn't it be good if you could go to your GP and it was your GP giving this kind of advice, like go and do some strength training and cut out the refined sugars?
I agree. I wish, and there are some amazing GPs out there. I just wish like a lot of them fall into sort of a couple of categories. It's some form of movement. Some movements are more specific to certain things than others. Eat a whole foods based diet that's clear, and reduce your stress, and add in, make sure you're getting enough sleep. And if you do those things, the thing is that they get to the root causes of why people are so unhealthy. So if you can tackle those, they're always going to be in almost any good plan that we have for any topic, because they're going to help your nervous system not be so fatigued. It's going to decrease systemic inflammation and cortisol. And all of that is a part of the root cause of why people aren't as healthy as they could be. And that's why they're not optimizing their health. Helen, anything from your good self?
Yeah, I think I keep having these aha moments, just in regards to like how significant blood sugar regulation is for so many different pillars of health. And it's just, it's such a fundamental, and I just think it's something that is so overlooked. And I'm just continually amazed at the flow-on effect for health and well-being, just with managing that.
It should definitely be in the couple of core pillars that almost every single person is kind of focusing on in some way or another, because the cascade from it is astronomical, really.
Yeah, it's huge. It's huge. I do have a question actually, because it sort of got me thinking about chronic yo-yo dieting, and how I think there are particular markers for health, I think related to like gallbladder health and function, which we often associate with obesity, but they're also very strongly linked to the pattern of chronic dieting and the stress that the sort of the gallbladder goes through. And I'm just wondering if there's any link between visceral fat percentage and those sorts of behaviors.
Oh, yeah, 100%. Yeah, like all fat would be associated with those, like the higher the fat percentage, the more the likelihood of those behaviors, but definitely the higher the visceral fat as well. And like when we talk like signaling pathways and hormone disruptors, when your leptin and ghrelin get thrown out, it's a pathway to helping lead to that kind of way of eating, if that makes sense, or that approach to nutrition, I should say. So it's why so keen to like reduce stress pathways for people, so that's why we don't do intuitive eating as the first thing that we do, because most people's hormones aren't giving them the right signaling that we want. So if we can get the hormones under control, then we can move down that phase if it's applicable for that person, for things like we're exactly talking about right now. So then, yeah, the gallbladder has to play a crucial role in the ups and downs of what someone's putting themselves through whatever the yo-yo is. And it could be everything from fasting to calorie restriction to, vegan to carnivore, and a whole bunch of the different things that people kind of cycle through, rather than just sticking to some core pillars, which isn't as sexy. I totally get that part, but definitely much more sustainable and much more appropriate for the body. Great question. Loved it. Guys, thank you. Like, I don't want to take up any more of your time on a Wednesday, but just want to thank everyone, or the pair of you, for kind of deep diving into a bit of holistic education with me today. I'm hoping that people have just a better understanding of why visceral fat's important, and potentially why they should track it, so that they can improve their health. And hopefully you've got some tools for your toolkit to stop riding the roller coaster of health that most people are on. Thank you very much, and have a great evening.